Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson called Working with Group Policy Exceptions. Now, in the last lesson, we learned about group policy objects and the order of application. In this lesson, we're going to go ahead and expand upon that and see exactly how to both configure your Active Directory infrastructure by creating an OU structure to support this GPO application, as well as how to alter the default LSDOU application processing order by using things like block inheritance, enforced, and security filtering. I'll also go over a setting called loopback processing and introduce you to the GP update command. So first, what's going on in the wonderful world of Global Mantics? Well, let's see. They're a worldwide organization which is continuing to grow. There are many challenges with creating an Active Directory structure which is organized in a way which will grow with the company. One of these challenges is to create an infrastructure which will support group policy application. Active Directory can be very flexible and supports many different methods of organization. We'll explore these different methods and establish the best structure to meet Global Mantic's needs. We'll also look at ways to modify the default application of group policy objects. All right, so basically, Global Mantics is a worldwide organization. But up to this point in this course, we've looked at them as just, kind of a smaller organization, maybe a medium-sized organization, just in one office. And so things have been pretty easy so far. But as we grow our Active Directory infrastructure to complete the entire Global Mantics organization, okay, in other words, once we expand out of New York, things are going to get a little crazy. So we need to be prepared for that. So we'll take a look at that in this lesson. Now, when it comes to creating an OU structure to support GPO application, here's the thing. I want you to remember, if you go back to when we first introduced what organizational units were, remember that OUs have an effect in 3 areas of the Active Directory infrastructure. One purpose for organizational units is just plain and simple for the organizing of objects. Now, that's pretty much how we've looked at it so far. We went ahead and created some OUs, and we created them based upon just being organized, right? We went ahead and created an organizational unit for New York, representing the New York office. And then inside there, we broke it down into New York users and New York computers. And then inside there, we even took New York computers and broke it down into servers and clients. Just trying to be organized. But a second purpose to our OU structure is for something called delegation of control. Now, that's something that we're going to address down the road later on in this course. But in this lesson, we're going to address the third purpose for OUs, which is GPO application. Again, in the last lesson, I had mentioned that GPOs can be linked to sites, domains, and organizational units, but they are primarily linked to organizational units. That's the main piece of functionality when it comes to controlling what group policies have effect on what users and computers, is by moving them into different organizational units and then linking the group policy object to that organizational unit. So we need to take a look at that here. Now, before we get into the actual OU structure, I want to talk to you about some exceptions to the rule, so to speak. Okay, in the last lesson, we learned about LSDOU, Local Site Domain Organizational Unit, which is the default order of group policy application and inheritance, and where we go through and look at the different policies in order, and when there are conflicting settings, the last one applied takes precedence. Well, here there are some exceptions that we want to look at. One exception is called block inheritance. Block inheritance is something that is set at the container level. Okay, so you go to a specific container and you can set a setting called block inheritance. And I'll show you this when we go into the operating system. You use this setting on a container when you don't want objects in that container to receive GPO settings from any parent containers. So what you're doing is you're saying, hey, I don't want you to go through the entire LSDOU process. If there is a user or computer in this container and block inheritance has been set, I want you to take the settings only from the GPO or GPOs, because you can have more than one GPO on a container, that are in this container. Now, the opposite of that would be a setting called enforced. Now, the enforced setting is something that you set on a GPO link. Okay, so not to a specific container. You don't go to the domain container and set enforced. You go to a group policy object that may be linked, let's say, to the domain. And you then put the enforced setting on when you want settings in that GPO. Okay, the link, the GPO that you're setting the setting on that particular link. You want the settings for that GPO and that link to apply to all child containers and objects, regardless of conflicting settings or block inheritance. Okay, so if you have a setting that you absolutely want set to, let's say, everybody in the domain, no matter what, then you create a group policy object with that setting. You link that group policy object to the domain, and then you set the enforced setting on that link. What that means is, even if there are other GPOs further down in the LSDOU process that normally would flip the switches the other direction and take precedence over the domain settings, in this case, they won't. They'll be ignored. Once you have enforced the settings on a link, those settings apply to everybody all the way down through the hierarchy, no matter what. Even if a container has block inheritance. Enforced overrides block inheritance. And again, I'll show you where this all is in just a few minutes. Another exception is something called security filtering. You use security filtering to control the application of GPO settings to users, groups, and computers using an access control list. Okay, where you do it almost more like what we're used to when it comes to like NTFS permissions and things like that, where we want to actually allow or not allow somebody access to something. Well, here we can say we want to apply a group policy or not apply a group policy to users, groups, and computers in that same access control list type fashion. Now, I will tell you that one of the things about security filtering is that a lot of people look at this as cool because they're like, wait a minute, I'm all confused with the whole linking to a container thing. Right? Group policy objects are linked to containers, which means they affect all the users in a container or all the computers in a container. And those users and computers, well, they may not be grouped in containers the same way they're grouped into different security groups in the domain. And a lot of users said, boy, I really wish I could have just said, hey, I want this group policy and I just want to apply it to all of the such and such group. And I can't, because all of that group, well, the individual users of that group are spread out throughout different containers within the domain. Well, security filtering doesn't quite work the way I just described. In other words, you still can't just say, all right, let's forget about linking to containers. Let's just use security filtering. What happens is you have to link a GPO to a container, and it will affect all objects in that container, but then you can use security filtering to further filter who or what in that container is affected by that group policy object. Now, one way that some people get around this, if they really are confused by the whole concept of linking to containers. And I've seen this done. It is not good practice. It's a very, very bad practice, but I've seen it done. Mostly going back to the early days of like Windows 2000 when this was new to everybody. Is I've seen it where administrators have created group policies and linked them all to the domain. So basically you go in and you look and you see all the policies linked to the domain. You see dozens of them, all linked to the same container, the domain. And then they use security filtering to further filter who that group policy applies to. Yes, you can do that. Not recommended. Not a good idea. Matter of fact, I'm going to take this a step further and I'm going to tell you that all three of these exceptions, block inheritance, enforced, and security filtering, they should all be used sparingly. They are available so that you can get yourself out of certain jams that you might be in. But the reality is that the recommended way to apply group policy in your network would be to create an OU structure that supports the group policy application needs. These exceptions should be just that. They should be the exceptions, not the rule. Okay? The reason you want to use these sparingly is because troubleshooting becomes that much more difficult when there are exceptions thrown into the mix, right? Troubleshooting works a lot better. I mean, if we just go back to troubleshooting 101, troubleshooting is just a matter of knowing a process and following it through and seeing where the breakdown is, right? That's how you figure out why something's not working. Well, if you throw additional exceptions into that process, it just makes troubleshooting that much harder. Okay, so now that I've told you, and in a moment here I'm going to show you how to do each of these exceptions, I want to tell you that you want to avoid doing so as much as possible. So let's go ahead and pop over to the operating system and see how this stuff all looks. Okay, so here we are on our Windows 7 client in the globalmantics.local domain. And the first thing I'd like to do is, well, let's go into Active Directory users and computers and take a look at our current OU structure. So let's go ahead and go here into Active Directory users and computers. And what do we have here? Well, you'll see here that pretty much all we've done is created an OU for the New York office. And inside there, we then said, here's a container for our computers, groups, and users. And if I were to expand computers, you'll see that breaks it down into the New York clients and member servers. And then, of course, here's our groups and here's our users. So that's pretty much the entire hierarchy. This is one way that OUs are sometimes structured. Sometimes we structure them based upon location. Okay, I'll tell you that there are three main areas of organization when it comes to OUs. One is location, one is department, and one is function. And function actually is looked at in different ways. I mean, some people look at function as in computers versus users. Other people look at function as in you're not necessarily part of a certain department, but you have a certain functionality in your job within an organization. Like maybe you're part of management. You're the manager of your own department, but we'll have a container for all the managers of all the departments. So these are the three main ways that OUs are organized within Active Directory. And usually what you have is you then have a breakdown of more than one. In other words, you may start off with location. So we say we created a top level OU for location. Here's one for New York. And then maybe I'll go ahead and create another OU for Chicago. And then create another OU for Dallas. And then create another OU for Tokyo. And then inside New York, Chicago, Dallas, and Tokyo, I will then create an OU structure within for maybe the departments. Okay, so maybe in Chicago, we go ahead and create an OU for sales and create another OU for marketing, and maybe create another OU for IT, another one for HR, etc., etc. Okay, so it's kind of the idea here that we have a top level OU structure based upon location, and then a substructure based upon department. Now, I've also seen it the other way around. I've seen it where the top level might be the departments. So we create a top level OU structure of sales, marketing, IT, HR, and then inside the sales container, we might have Chicago sales and New York sales and Dallas sales. And then inside the marketing container, we have New York marketing and Chicago marketing, etc., etc. Okay, so there is no one right way to do it. There is no one wrong way to do it. The idea is to go ahead and create an OU structure that is going to A, support, well, just being organized, right? You want to be able to quickly and easily find things. B, support delegation of control, which is something that we'll look at in a later lesson. And C, support the application of group policy, which is what we're talking about in this lesson. So what we would want to do is go ahead and create an OU structure that supports the application of group policy for our Global Mantics domain. Now, the other thing I want to tell you before we get into anything else is when you are figuring out your OU structure, you may run into kind of a roadblock. It'll be quite a headache. It really will. Many administrators go through this, which is where you say, well, all right, I'm supposed to support being organized, I'm supposed to support delegation of control, and I'm supposed to support group policy application. And I'm finding that it's almost impossible to do all three. In other words, you may want your OUs to look a certain way to support delegation of control, but by using your structure that way, group policy application is much trickier. Or you may say, all right, well, I'll do it this way to support group policy application, but now delegation of control is out the door. What you need to do is you need to look at those three areas of functionality: being organized, delegation of control, and group policy application. And you need to rank them. That's the first thing you need to do when you are creating your OU structure. You need to look at those three functions and say, in my organization, which is the most important to me? Or maybe instead of just saying to yourself, say most important to the organization, because that's really what's important. And then look to see what's second most important and then what's third most important. And what you do is you then create an OU structure based upon what is most important. Then you may tweak that OU structure a little bit or maybe add to it to support whatever's second most important. And if possible, hopefully what's third most important, well, at least you've covered it a little bit, we hope. But otherwise, it's probably going to be somewhat thrown out the window because it's not as important as the other two functions. Okay, so that is something that you're going to want to do, is you're really going to want to go ahead and rank what's most important to that particular organization, and then organize your OUs based upon that. All right, so here in Global Mantics, I'll tell you what, I think that if we were to go by location first, and then department second, almost like what you see that I've done here in the Chicago office. And then if anything, we may, and again, this is there's differences of opinions on what functionality really means. But third, within the departments, break it down, if necessary, into users and computers. That will probably give us the level of support that we need for group policy application, and later on, when we get to delegation of control. And quite frankly, I think it still keeps us pretty organized. Now, the reasoning behind location first, departments second, is because one of the things that you also want to keep in mind is you want your top level OUs to be as static as possible. So when looking at an organization, very often the location, the likeliness of moving to another location, so the likeliness of Global Mantix leaving New York with its corporate headquarters, or leaving Chicago, or leaving Dallas, or leaving Tokyo, is slim. Okay, they're in those locations for a very specific reason, and they're probably going to stay there for a long time. Whereas the departments, departments change all the time. Right? You have, first of all, users who move from one department to another all the time. Not to say that they don't move from one location to another. They do. But they switch departments all the time. But then what about reorg? That's really the important thing. What about reorganization, where you take the entire company and say, you know what? We're not going to have sales department and a marketing department. Now we have a sales and marketing department. We don't have an IT department. We have an operations department. Okay, so, or how about HR? Maybe HR is now broken down split into two different departments, right? One department for benefits, another one for actual hiring, maybe a third one for employee issues. Okay, these kinds of things happen in companies all the time. So you want your top level to be whatever's going to be most static. And so I think that for Global Mantix, the location is the most static. So I put that on top. The second thing is that every office does not necessarily have every single department. We don't necessarily have a sales department in all 4 offices. In Global Mantix, I can tell you there's a sales department in New York and in Chicago and in Tokyo, but not Dallas. Whatever organization you work for, or maybe you will work for in the future, may or may not fall into this same situation. So, with that being said, let's take a look at this. Let's go ahead and look at New York. And you'll see that right now we've got New York computers, New York groups, and New York users. That doesn't necessarily work. So what we need to do is we need to change the OU structure. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording of this lesson. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to create a bunch of OUs and make New York look kind of like Chicago. And when we come back, I'll show you, and then I'll give you an opportunity where you can go ahead and pause the lesson as well and then create matching OUs if you're trying to follow along. Okay, so what I've done here is in the New York container, I created 4 new OUs, one called New York HR, one called New York IT, New York Marketing, and New York Sales. What I then did, now you may remember that we previously had New York Groups, which we still have, okay? And the reason why is because group policy is not applied to groups, okay? The group policy object settings are applied to users and computers. So if I were to take a group policy object and link it to the New York Groups container, it's not necessarily going to affect the sales group because the users are, well, they're sitting over in a different container. The other thing I did was I took the New York Computers container and I moved it into the New York IT container. Now here's the thing. This may or may not work out with how we want group policy to be applied, in the sense that we may need to break our computers down into which are the HR computers, which are the marketing computers, which are the sales computers, and which are the actual IT computers. Maybe yes, maybe no. What I'm doing here is I'm kind of trying to balance things out into our future need for delegation of control. So I put New York computers, including the subcontainers of New York clients and member servers, inside New York IT, because the IT staff is very possibly who we're going to go ahead and have manage those computers. And the New York users container, I eliminated. But before eliminating it, I went ahead and I moved those users into the 4 different departments: HR, IT, marketing, and sales. Now, if you are following along and you want to create the exact same structure, please feel free to go ahead and pause this lesson and create this structure. I will tell you that which users were put into which container is not significant. As long as you pay attention to which container we are referencing when we go ahead and log in as a particular user, you can use any user that's in that container where you're at. Now, the other thing I'm going to tell you is you may notice that there's a lot more stuff here than there was before. And the reason for that is because up here on the View menu, I enabled advanced features. And the reason I enabled these advanced features was in order to go ahead and move the New York computers OU into New York IT, and in order to delete the New York users OU, what I had to do is I had to go into, and I'm just going to pick on New York groups here, I had to go into the properties, and I had to go to the object tab and clear the box for protecting object from accidental deletion. And that's only there if you are viewing the advanced features. So as you are trying to emulate what I'm doing here, that is something you may run into as well. So just want to make sure that you know that that's why I've done that. Now, since I already have that complete, I'm going to go ahead and stop viewing advanced features. Okay. And we're just going to focus here on New York. So if you want to go ahead and pause this lesson and get yourself to where I am, go ahead and do so. What we're going to go ahead and do now is go into the Group Policy Management Council. So I'll click Start. Here's our Group Policy Management Council. And you'll see here that if I expand domains and expand globalmantics.local, now I see Chicago, Dallas, domain controllers, New York, and Tokyo. And if I expand New York, you'll see that I see New York groups, HR, IT, marketing, sales. If I expand New York IT, I see New York computers. Expand that, I get clients and member servers. In other words, our group policy management utility can also see our new OU structure. So let's take a look at some of these exceptions. All right, so if I just go ahead and pick a container, so let's go ahead and pick New York IT, as long as I'm right here. If I right-click on that container, you will see there is a selection here for block inheritance. And if I click on it, you'll see I get the little blue circle with an exclamation mark on it, representing that block inheritance has been enabled. And what I've done is I've made it that this container is saying, I don't want group policy settings from above. So I'm not going to take group policy settings from the New York container. And I'm not going to take group policy settings from the domain container. And I'm not going to take settings from the site container, which would be down here, but we're not dealing with sites. Okay, but if we were dealing with sites, it would ignore that as well. In other words, in the LSDOU, OU process, we're basically saying take only the settings from a group policy object linked to this specific container. Now, another setting that we talked about was something called enforced. Enforced is done on a link, not on a group policy object, but a link. So up here we have our default domain policy, and it is a link, right? It's linked to the domain. If I right click on this link, you'll see there is a setting for enforced. If I click on enforced, you'll see that you get an extra little symbol there. There's a little lock symbol representing that this policy is enforced. And so what that means is that the settings in this policy will take place all the way down through the rest of the hierarchy, even for New York IT, because enforced is going to override block inheritance. All right, so that's how you can set up block inheritance and enforced. Remember, block inheritance you do on a container. Enforced you do on a link. The last exception was something called security filtering. Now, security filtering you do on the actual group policy object. So if I take a particular group policy object, okay, so we can go ahead and say disable control panel. We'll take that particular group policy object. Doesn't really matter which one. I can go over here to, well, there's really two ways of doing this. One way of doing it is right here where it says security filtering. The settings in this GPO can only apply to the following groups, users, and computers. And you'll notice that by default, because we haven't done anything, we just created this GPO in the last lesson. By default, well, it applies to all authenticated users. Everybody. If I wanted to only apply to a specific user or specific group or specific computers, then what I could do is I could go ahead and add, and I'll put in sales, because I have a sales group, right? I have a security group called sales. And we'll actually remove, and it's just warning me, are you sure you want to do this? Yep, I'm sure I want to do that. Now, this particular group policy object, no matter where it's linked. Okay, remember the link comes first. Doing this does not make this policy affect users who are a member of the sales group. The first thing is what container is this particular group policy object linked to? Then from there, so let's say it was linked to the New York container. Then from there, we would be able to further filter it down to only users in the New York container that are a member of the sales group. Now, another way of doing security filtering, and this is possibly the more common way, is let me go ahead and let me add authenticated users back in, and let's eliminate sales. Okay, and then you'll notice you can have more than one on the list. So I could have said sales users and administrator. I could have just picked a user to add to it. It doesn't really matter. But another way of doing security filtering is by going up here to the delegation tab and then coming down here to the advanced button. And this is a window that should look kind of familiar to you, or at least the window should have a familiarity to it. You've never seen the window before, but it looks similar to other ACL related windows like NTFS permissions and shared permissions and printer permissions and Active Directory permissions. Well, here what we can do is we can go ahead and we can add users and computers and groups to the ACL and then pick the level of permissions that particular user, computer, or group has over the group policy. Now, I don't want to get too deep right now into the detailed, what level of permission you need to do different things in group with a group policy object. But there is one specific permission I want to point out to you. And that is if I scroll down here, this one right here, apply group policy. In order for group policy to have an effect on a user, a computer, or group, they have to have two permissions allowed. So that's why I clicked on authenticated users, just to show you. You have to be able to read the group policy object, and you have to be allowed to apply the group policy. You have to have those two things. So what happens very often when using security filtering is it's not so much that you create a group policy object and you say, only apply this group policy to a specific group, like we did back on the scope tab. Okay, back up here on the scope tab when we were under the security filtering section where we said only apply it to these users. What happens more often is that you leave it as applying to all authenticated users, and then you come in here and you take a specific user or group and say, I don't want this group policy object to apply to this user or group. In other words, you're saying apply to everybody except this particular user or group. So I could go ahead and, as a for instance, here's domain administrators. I might go ahead and say deny apply group policy. And now what's going to happen is this group policy object is going to apply to all authenticated users in the domain except the domain admins. And that's probably the more common way for security filtering to be put in place in most organizations. So I'll go ahead and click OK. Now you'll notice, just like we saw with any other permissions, as soon as you put a deny always overrides allow. So you get this warning box saying, are you sure you know what you're doing? Yep, I know what I'm doing, so I'll click yes. Okay. If I go back to the scope tab just to show you, because I mentioned it, scope tab, in case you weren't noticing, that's where we were before. Here's where that other security filtering is. You'll notice it still says apply to authenticated users. But this particular group policy object is not going to apply to domain admins. Now, if we want to test some of this out real quick, well, let's try it. Okay, let's try a few things and see how this works. Now, the first thing I want to do is let's go up here to the default domain policy and let's eliminate enforced, okay? So we have our default domain policy. It's in place. We got a bunch of settings, but it's not enforced. Let's go in and edit this policy, and let's do like we did in the last lesson, and let's keep picking on the same setting, which is prohibit access to control panel. Let's enable that. Okay, so what we've just done is we've made it that no one in the domain should have access to the control panel, right? Because it says so in the default domain policy. So now down here, you'll notice that we have block inheritance on New York IT. Okay, so we have block inheritance on New York IT, and I'm going to pick on two different containers here. We're going to say New York IT, and then we're going to look at New York sales. Okay, and what I want to do is come over here to Active Directory users and computers. Let's click on New York IT, and let's pick a user. So let's do Terry Edwards, right? This one right here, Terry Edwards. And in the sales container, let's go ahead and let's do Edward Gonzalez. Okay? So go ahead and jot those down, all right? And again, if you're following along, it can be any user that you have in these containers. But over here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do Terry Edwards. And just to make it really confusing because of the last name Edwards, down in sales, we're going to do Edward Gonzalez. Now, why did I pick on these two containers? Well, if we come back over here to Group Policy Management, New York IT users, we have block inheritance. So we shouldn't have that setting coming down from the default domain policy. Okay? Whereas with New York sales, we don't have block inheritance, so we should have that setting come down. Well, why don't we go ahead and test this and see how it works out. So let's go ahead and close out of everything. Go ahead and log off. And then we'll go ahead and log in, switch user here. Who do you want to do first? Let's do T Edwards. And of course, since this is the first time we're logging on, I need to change the password. So let's go ahead and do that now. And the password's been changed. Go ahead and click OK. And as we've seen before, it's going to take just a moment. The first time we log on as a user, it needs to go ahead and create a profile on this particular machine. But again, remember, what it's also doing is it's going through and looking at the whole LSDOU process and now possibly taking into consideration block inheritance. So let's see. Logged on as T. Edwards. If I click Start, do we have Control Panel? Yes, we do. Why do we have it? Because block inheritance is set up for Terry Edwards, who's in the New York IT container. Now, if we go ahead and log out of here and log back in, switch user, other user. This time we're going to do Edward Gonzalez. Again, having to change password the first time. You think maybe I should somehow get rid of that rule? Something to keep in mind. Obviously, in this type of an environment, it's kind of a nuisance because I'm logging in as all these different users. In the real world, that's a very good thing because we want each of these users the first time they're logging in to go ahead and have to do this. So anyway, we now have Edward Gonzalez. Password is changed. Logging in. Again, it'll take just a moment. Here we go. Get to the desktop. Now, because this user is part of the sales, or to be more specific, the New York sales container, which did not have block inheritance, didn't have any group policy objects assigned to it, should have got the setting from the domain, which is to disable the control panel. So if I click Start, no control panel. If I try to get to it, control panel, denied. So it works. All right, so let's go ahead and log off again. Go ahead and log back in as our administrator. All right, and then we'll go ahead and go back into our group policy management utility. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and take that default domain policy and we're going to enforce that link. Okay, again, we're not enforcing the actual default domain policy itself. It's the link on the domain. New York IT still has block inheritance, but because enforced has been put in place, even when Terry Edwards logs in, even though block inheritance is in place, we should get that setting. So let's see if that happens. Let's go ahead and log off. And log back in as T. Edwards. And this time, we go ahead and click on Start. Control panel is gone. If I try to go to the control panel, I'm not allowed. Okay, so as you can see, enforced takes precedence over block inheritance. So let's go ahead and log out of here. Log back in as our Global Mantix administrator. By the way, you may wonder why I keep typing out Global Mantix /administrator. Let me show you why. If I just type in administrator, well, before I do anything else, any other user I type in, it says log on to Global Mantix. Why? Because this computer is a member of the Global Mantix domain. But if I type in administrator, because there is a local administrator account with that name, it assumes as soon as you put that name in that you want to log into the local machine. And that's why I have to put in Global Mantix /administrator to get it back to the Global Mantix administrator account. Okay, now we're logged back in as administrator. Let's go back into our group policy management utility. And what do we want to do? Well, let's go ahead and let's try using security filtering. First thing I want to do is let's go ahead and do two things here. One, let's not make this default domain policy link enforced anymore. Second, let's go into that policy. Let me expand that here. And let's go ahead and take away that setting. Okay, so I'll change it back to not configured. Click OK. Close out of there. The next thing I want to do is for New York IT, let's get rid of block inheritance. Okay, so everything's back the way it should be. Now, let's go ahead and take our disable control panel group policy object. That's the one that actually disables the control panel. And let's link it to the New York container. Okay, so link an existing GPO, disable control panel. What I then want to do is I want to go ahead and through security filtering, I'm going to go ahead and say that this is going to apply to everybody within this container and all of its subcontainers, which means whether I log in as Terry Edwards or Edward Gonzalez, it doesn't matter. Both of them are going to have the control panel disabled. Let's come over here to delegation, and actually let's do delegation for disable control panel. Go to advanced. And what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add, and I'm going to go ahead and add in E. Gonzalez. Check names, make sure I spelled it right. I did. And E. Gonzalez, we are going to go ahead and deny the apply of group policy. We also could deny read, but it's not necessary. As long as one of them is denied, because you have to have both of them allowed in order for it to work. So I'm going to deny the applying of this particular group policy to Edward Gonzalez. Go ahead and click OK. And let's see what happens. If I close out of here, log off once again. Let's go ahead and log in. Well, first let's log in as T. Edwards, just to show that this policy is affecting users in the entire New York OU and sub-OUs, that whole hierarchy. And if I click Start, no control panel, I don't need to show you trying to go to it. I think you get it. If it's not here, you're not getting to it. So we'll just log off. And now go ahead and switch user and log in as E. Gonzalez. And if everything worked correctly, we should have access to the control panel. Click Start, control panel. There it is. Okay, so that's how we could control it through security filtering. So let's go ahead and log out. And log back in as the administrator. And then go back into Group Policy Management. I want to mention something to you here. Are you getting kind of annoyed with the log in, log out, log in, log out, log in, log out, back and forth with all these different users? Plus, in the real world, would you be doing that? Would you want to actually go out to a client computer and try logging in as these different users? No, you wouldn't want to do all that. So just a reminder, and if you need to, go back to the previous lesson where I show you exactly how to use it. This is where the group policy modeling wizard can really come in handy. Because rather than logging off and logging in as all these different users, or going around to your different client computers and logging in as these different users to see what happens, you could just run the group policy modeling wizard for each one of these users and see what happens. Okay, so that's where this really comes in handy. Now, there's another thing that I would like to show you, and when it comes to the whole order of applying group policies. And that is, if I were to go to the New York container, you'll see here that there's one GPO that's linked here, and it's Disable Control Panel. If I right-click and say Link an existing GPO, and, well, let's do Enable Control Panel. Now, I know this is ridiculous. Why would you link disabling of a control panel and then link enabling a control panel? Well, you wouldn't. But those are the two GPOs I happen to have right here. So I just want to show you that once I link the second GPO, you'll see here that there's a link order. And this is another thing to keep in mind when going through the LSDOU process. Besides local policies, then site-related group policies, then domain-linked group policies, and then OU-linked group policies, what happens when you have multiple group policies all linked to the same container? Well, then we get a link order. And that link order will again have to do with, all right, this one gets applied first, and then this one gets applied second. And there is a significance to that because, well, if there are conflicting settings, the one that is applied last is going to take precedence. So that's just one other thing that I want you to keep in mind when you link multiple GPOs to a single container. Now, the reality is that if you're doing things correctly, you really shouldn't have conflicting settings in multiple GPOs linked to the same container. It is possible. It might happen. But for the most part, if you're doing things correctly, you may have multiple GPOs linked to a single container, but one's going to be for doing one thing and one will be for doing something completely different, and then all settings are applied. All right, now let's go talk about another setting which will affect some of this processing, and it's called the loopback processing setting. So what is loopback processing? Well, here is the actual definition from Microsoft. Group policy applies to the user or computer in a manner that depends on where both the user and the computer objects are located in Active Directory. However, in some cases, users may need policy applied to them based on the location of the computer object alone. You can use the group policy loopback feature to apply group policy objects that depend only on which computer the user logs onto. Now, the reason I listed the official definition and read it to you is because I wanted you to see how confusing it is. And if you didn't find it confusing, great. But the average person does. I will tell you that loopback processing, I heard explained wrong at least a dozen times before I finally got a hold of somebody at Microsoft and got them to explain it to me exactly the way it does work. Okay, so I want to make sure that you get this because this is something that not everybody does. Basically, here's what happens. When a computer turns on, the computer will go through the LSDOU process, and when it does this, it'll do it based upon the container where the computer object is located. And for each policy that is linked to any of the containers that the computer object is associated with, it will look at the computer configuration settings of that policy. But that's it. It will not look at the user settings. Matter of fact, if you ever have a group policy object that you have, let's say both computer and user settings, but it's linked to a container that only has computers or only has users, well, then half the settings are being completely ignored. They'll never be looked at. And that's because, like I said, when the computer turns on, it goes through the LSDOU process, only looking at the computer configuration side of any of the policies that apply. When a user logs in, the exact same thing happens. It goes through the LSDOU process, but again, only takes the group policy objects that are linked to the containers where the user object is. And again, we'll only look at the user configuration settings in those group policy objects. What loopback processing does is it makes it that the user-based settings can be applied when a user logs in, but not based upon where the user object exists, but going back to where the computer object is. So in a scenario where you have a computer that it doesn't matter who logs in, you don't care what user logs in, you want the same settings to take place. Both the computer configuration settings, but also the user configuration settings. Then you enable loopback processing on a group policy that is linked to the container where that computer object resides. Now, I'm going to show you this to you in just a moment, but I also want you to know that there are two different modes of loopback processing. There is merge mode loopback processing, and this is where both the user settings from where the user object resides and the user settings from the group policy objects from the containers where the computer resides will be implemented. They'll merge them together. But if there is a conflict, the computer setting, or I should say the GPO that is linked to the container where the computer is, will take precedence. Replace mode is where you just flat out say, look, I don't care what user logs in. I want you to completely ignore GPOs that are linked to the containers where the user object is. I only want you to use the GPOs linked to the container where the computer object is. So let's go ahead and take a look at where this setting is. All right, so back here on our Windows 7 client, we're in our group policy management utility. We could pick any group policy object because pretty much we just want to go in and see where loopback processing exists. So I'm going to go ahead and just pick the default domain policy here, edit. And under computer configuration, we're going to expand policies, expand administrative templates. Let me go ahead and maximize this so we can see as much as we can here. Going to expand system, and then here we have group policy. And then down here at the bottom of this long list, you'll see user group policy loopback processing mode. So let me go ahead and double click on that one. And if we enable this, you'll see that we then have a choice between replace mode or merge mode. Now I also want you to notice that where I located this was in the computer configuration. And that's important because this setting needs to be put into place when the computer first boots up. Because obviously a computer will boot before a user logs in, right? So when the computer boots up, it's already going through and it's going to find this GPO and it's going to find on the computer configuration half this particular setting. Now again, if this setting is set, what we then want to do is go ahead and set up any user configuration based policy settings that we want to have applied to all the users. And what will happen is when a user logs in, it doesn't matter what container the user is in, it's going to come back to this group policy. And it's going to go to the user configuration half of this policy because this policy is the one that is linked to the container where the computer is. And it's going to apply these user configuration settings. Now again, remember, if you're in merge mode, it will matter what container the user's in because the user will get those group policy settings and these group policy settings. But these group policy settings will take precedence if there is a conflict. Now, there is one last thing, and actually let me go ahead and I want to not Okay, good. I didn't configure it. I wasn't sure if I had set it or not. I don't want to actually set up loopback. I just want to show you where it was. There's one last thing I want to show you, and that is a utility called GP Update. Now, as I have linked and set settings on different group policy objects and then wanted to demonstrate them for you, I've logged off and then logged in as different users. And yes, it is true that if you were in a production environment and you implemented a group policy object full of settings, those settings would not take effect until, if they were computer-based settings, until the computer was rebooted. If they're user-based settings, until the user logs in. Okay, so computer-based settings affect the computer when the computer reboots, or we'll just say when it boots. And user-based settings don't affect the user until they log in. Well, that's only partially true. The reality is that settings will get updated on computers within a certain time frame. So let's say you have a user who is just never logging out. Well, that's okay. Well, first of all, you'd probably want to go ahead and push some kind of policy that forces them to log out. You don't want to leave people logged in all night, every night. Security issue there. But what I will tell you is that there is a time window, and even that time window can be defined within a group policy setting. But by default, domain controllers will have their group policy settings updated in only 5 minutes. And a regular non-domain controller, member server, or client computer will have their settings updated in 90 minutes. But if you ever wanted to go ahead and so let's say, for instance, you have a user calling you up and saying, hey, I don't know what's going on here, but I don't have access to such and such, or I lost access to such and such, or I'm supposed to have such and such, whatever it may be. And you look and you determine, oh, there's a group policy setting that's causing that. So you alter the group policy settings, and then you tell the user, okay, go ahead and log off and log back on again. Well, that can be kind of a nuisance, right? Because the user may have 14 different applications running. They don't feel like closing everything, logging off, and reopening everything when they log back in. Now, the other option is they can just wait up to 90 minutes and then check and see if the setting works. Well, that's not very practical either. So what we can use is a tool called GP Update to force group policy to update on that particular client. So, as a for instance, let me go ahead and let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and take these and delete those links. Okay, so we're going to get rid of that disable and enable control panel. By the way, you'll notice instead of deleting the link, I could also just clear that checkbox and then it's not enabled. Okay, link enabled? No. So it's not actually doing anything. Okay, or put the checkbox back and yes, link is enabled. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and delete the link altogether. What I then want to do is come up here to the domain. And let's go ahead and right click and link an existing GPO. Let's link disable control panel. Now, the other thing I want to look at here is under delegation for domain admins. Yeah, see, we denied apply, and we don't want to do that. Matter of fact, let's also take Edward Gonzalez. Let's take Edward Gonzalez completely off the list. So now it does apply to everyone again. Click OK. So basically what we've done is we've made it that disabling the control panel is true for everybody. If I come over here and click Start, you'll notice the control panel is still there. If I try to open it, I can still get to it. And the reason why is because, well, in order to have this group policy take effect, I need to log off and log back in again, right? Because that's a user-based setting. Or because this is a Windows 7 client, I could wait up to 90 minutes. Well, that's no good either. So the other option is to go ahead and click Start and type in GP Update. And you'll see here it's updating the policy. And in just a moment, you'll see that it says that the computer settings have been, or actually, I'm sorry, the user policy has been updated. And then it'll say that the computer policy has been updated. And then the window disappears. If you don't want the window to disappear, then instead of typing it right here in the search programs, you go into a command prompt and then type it, and then it will stay up on the window. But anyway, now that we have done a GP update, which is basically running that utility is telling the client, all right, go back out there and pretend like you've just rebooted and logged back in again, and let's redo all our group policy settings. So now when I click on start, notice the control panel is gone. And it is truly gone. If I type in control panel, try to access it, I can't. Even though I'm logged in as domain admin, it doesn't matter. I said at the domain level, disable the control panel for everybody. Domain admin is part of everybody in the domain. GP update allowed me to go ahead and make it happen right away without having to log off, without having to close utilities that I'm working on, and then have to log back in again. So when you are speaking to a user and you make that change to group policy, instead of telling the user to log off and log on or to reboot their computer, tell them to run a GP update. Now, I will tell you that GP update doesn't always work. Likewise, that 5-minute and 90-minute rule doesn't always work. There are certain group policy settings that absolutely require a reboot or absolutely require you to log off and log back on again. Okay, I don't have a list of them, but there are specific settings that you will find just don't work unless you go through the full process. So I don't want you to get frustrated and say, well, Ed told me GP update and we did it and it's not working. Sometimes it won't, but most of the time it will. Now, the other thing I will tell you is that GP update has a number of other switches, as they're called, so additional commands that go with it to work with different aspects of updating group policy. I'm not going to get into that here. I will also tell you that those are for very isolated, specific circumstances. For the most part, when it comes to GP update, just use the tool. Just GP update. So let's go ahead and let's eliminate this disable control panel link. Don't need that there, right? So go ahead and delete that link. And then, of course, what do we want to do now? Since control panel is still not here, well, GP update. And it's going to go ahead and update the policy. And as soon as it goes through and the user settings and the computer settings have been updated, I should have my control panel back. It's done. Click start. And there's my control panel. So let's go ahead and close that and close that. And let's go see what we've learned in this lesson. All right, so what did we cover? Well, we talked about Global Mantics and their needs as to why we're even looking at all of this. And really what it comes down to is the larger the organization, the more structured you need to be in Active Directory. Okay, you need to have an OU structure that's going to support that growth. And you need to be very scalable in your design. And speaking of that design, remember, when it comes to your OU structure, there's 3 main functions that go along with that. There is organization, just being organized. There's delegation of control, and there's group policy application. You need to prioritize the importance of those 3 functions and then create an OU structure that supports your primary function, and then if possible, move on to your secondary and maybe even your third function. Beyond creating the perfect OU structure, because I'll tell you what, it'd be great. In a perfect world, we have a perfect OU structure. But we can't all be in a perfect world, so we have certain exceptions that we can use called block inheritance, which is set on a container to say, I don't want to take settings from above in the hierarchy. We have the enforced setting, which is where you typically set it actually fairly high in the hierarchy and on a link that says, everybody below me, you're getting these settings, like it or not. And we have security filtering, which is where we can use our access control lists to help further filter who or what a group policy applies to or doesn't apply to. And again, remember, there's kind of two ways to approach security filtering. You can create a GPO and say this GPO only affects certain users or groups or computers. Or you could do the other direction, which is this group policy applies to everyone except those that we have denied the apply of this group policy. We learned about loopback processing, which will also have a little bit of an effect on the application of group policy, because we may want to have the user settings from a group policy linked to the computer container take effect, as opposed to the user settings from the container where the user resides. Or we may want both, but then the ones where the computer container is will take precedence. And then we saw how GP update can really help save an end user from the nuisance of having to log off and log back on or reboot their computer. I mean, they hear that often enough when they call into help desk and they're having a problem, and one of the first things that help desk instructs a user to do is log off and log back on or reboot and see if the problem goes away. Well, this is a great way to not have to have them continually logging off or rebooting their computer. All right. Well, that's what I have for you in this lesson. I will see you in the next one.